Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Eyes on Munich today. There were a couple of important stories that we're following. You've got negotiations, of course, that are getting underway in Munich with regard to Ukraine. You've also got an important deadline tomorrow in Gaza that we're going to be talking to Michael Allen about here. A high noon deadline put forth by Donald Trump said all hell will break out if hostages are not released. And Hamas had been dragging its feet on the idea of a continued release here. It appears it will be on schedule. Very unclear how many hostages and what condition they will be in. Michael Allen is managing director of Beacon Global Strategies and spent time as special assistant to President George W. Bush as part of his national security team. It's great to see you. Welcome back.
Good to see you, Jeff.
So we want to talk about a couple of things here, and we'll start in Munich. Okay. I know you're no stranger to the Munich Security Conference, and it is now apparently the staging ground for at least the opening salvo in talks over Ukraine.
That's
J.D.
right.
Vance is talking about a lot of things today, including the idea of American troops being on the table in Ukraine. Do you buy that?
Wow, I was shocked by the inclusion of that in J.D. Vance's remarks. Of course, he means, I believe, a tripwire force, part of some sort of peacekeeping operation. But just 2 days after Hegseth dismissed that there would be U.S. soldiers involved in such an arrangement, it was definitely a surprise to see Vice President Vance come in and say, well, not only U.S. troops, but sanctions as well are on the table.
So he's trying to talk tough against Russia. They're trying to compel, I guess, Vladimir Putin to the table, but Donald Trump was on the phone with him for an hour and a half the other day. What'd they talk about?
Well, they talked about Ukraine, certainly. It sounds like the president also talked about wanting to get rid of nuclear weapons, and they even talked about artificial intelligence. But I think Ukraine was the most thing they talked about, and I think he's trying to induce Putin to the table. Maybe they meet in the Middle East in the coming weeks. But I think it's Trump starting to set the conditions under which he can get into a real negotiation.
He says Vladimir Putin wants to get out. Russia wants to get out of this thing. Do you believe that? Is he looking for an off-ramp? How come he couldn't find one with Joe Biden?
I believe at most that Putin's looking for is a brief ceasefire in order to have his arms back
so
again.
You doubt his motivations entirely.
Well, because I don't think the underlying problems with why there is a war are going to be addressed, and which is that Ukraine, he doesn't want them to exist. He sees them as a security threat. He doesn't like NATO approaching his borders. So Putin's been suffering. He needs more arms. He needs time for his economy to recover. It's starting to go down. And so I think at most he would want a ceasefire. A peace agreement, I doubt it.
The idea of going back to pre-2014 boundaries, Crimea included.
Yeah.
Secretary of Defense says unrealistic. He had to walk back some of those remarks. Is he right?
I think it's unrealistic to expect them to vacate Crimea or really almost any territory that they already
the Donbass
have.
Goes to Russia, too.
I'm afraid that at least half the Donbass might go to Russia. Maybe they put it in some special status and try to say that there'll be a vote sometime in the future. Just to
that
sort
sounds
of
familiar.
Yeah, to preserve some sort of face-saving arrangement for Zelenskiy. But yeah, it's hard to imagine. Can you see Russian troops rolling back from any of the territory that they've already gotten? Maybe only if they're trading Kursk, and that's the Russian territory that the Ukrainians have set up camp in.
Suggesting that was a pretty smart move for
I think
Zelensky.
so.
Just big picture then. This does not sound like a Michael Allen who expects this war to end, well, certainly not on day one, but in the initial stages of this new presidency.
I can't see it ending for a long period of time. Wow. I mean, this could come back again. I mean, we had 2014 and then we had 2022. And I think Vladimir Putin's got very serious designs on this particular piece of territory. I'm hopeful that we won't have a third war, if you will. If we have a real European peacekeeping force, a real tripwire there, we have to do actual security guarantees, if not NATO, then they need to have some assurances that the West will be there for them. Because what Zelenskiy needs is he needs to have his country back. He needs to feel safe enough, and companies need to feel safe enough to go there and invest and attract his refugees back. And if it feels like a cheap ceasefire, neither of those things will happen.
And if Putin's goal is to reconstitute the Soviet Union, we're just spending a lot of time talking for nothing here.
Yeah.
Spending time with Michael Allen on Balance of Power, I want to move to Israel and what might take place tomorrow. We've seen a lot of cross currents here between Hamas and Israel when it comes to hostages in Gaza, approaching a potential phase 2 under the ceasefire. Donald Trump this week decides to say if they're not all out by noontime Saturday, hell breaks out. That threat seemed to work pretty well last time. Will it tomorrow?
I think so. A few hours ago, Hamas, through an intermediary, said, here are the 3 hostages that we plan to release. So I think things are still on track. It's never great to feel super about it until it actually happens. There's definitely a lot of stress in the relationship. I think the president constantly talking about Gaza and maybe the Palestinians not being able to come back might be sort of destabilizing for this in the future. I think they need to try and get Israel's commitments to roll back their troops out of populated areas. That needs to continue to happen so that the conditions that for us to proceed down into phase 2 will obtain.
Boy, he said a lot the other day and indicated that he needed to see more than 3 hostages. Did you read his words to suggest the scheduled release must go forward, or that every hostage must be released tomorrow?
The latter. I saw him say very clearly that I want them all back now.
So
I don't know that if he I don't know that if he attached, though, all hell break loose to all of them coming back on Saturday. He definitely said, I want them all back. I'm tired of this process, but it may be enough that they're back in train, and then maybe that'll satisfy Trump.
This is what happens when you're trying to parse the words here. I want to remind everybody that you were the first person on this broadcast, I think it was about 2 weeks ago, around the time Donald Trump met with Benjamin Netanyahu, to say that they were, in fact, talking about a lot more than Gaza. They were talking about a preemptive strike against Iran.
Definitely.
And that this is, in fact, something that is in the works. Reporting in the days following our interview suggested that this is, in fact, underway. Are we going to see an Israeli strike against Iran?
I think it's getting more and more likely because the conditions for Israel to be able to do this are in good shape. It's because there is no real air defense system, radars in Syria, even in Tehran. There is a sense that because there's no Hezbollah, they have a freer shot in order to go hit Iran, inside Iran proper. I think what people are digesting now is that will it be a complete destruction of their nuclear program or just degrading? And it's going to be just degrading. It's too spread out. It's been going on for too long. I think what they're really down to is, do they have the precise weaponry to be able to penetrate into the mountain complex that houses the main centrifuge hub called Fordow? That's, I think, what they're looking for. There are rumors that the Israelis are getting the right weaponry from us, but I don't know that I've seen it confirmed yet.
So they use American-made bunker-busting bombs.
Exactly.
Does America help execute the operation by intelligence or any other means?
I think by intelligence, certainly. I don't know that, however, Trump will allow one of our cargo planes or a B-2 in order to do it. I mean, the Israelis, I think, could do it through their own cargo plane, but there are a lot of people trying to study this right now.
What does Saudi Arabia think of this idea?
I think they're not excited about it. When you think about Mohammed bin Salman, what he wants and what he's been talking about forever is Vision 2030. He wants to be able to develop his economy, diversify it away from oil. And I don't think, even though he doesn't like the Iranians, I don't think he really wants to see a war break out between the two. I think he, over time, wants to see some sort of progress with the Palestinians so that he can normalize with Israel, because ultimately that's what's good for his economy. That's like the Silicon Valley of the Middle East, and he knows he needs to have good relations there.
Fascinating. I'm guessing that King Abdullah of Jordan is not sleeping well at night. He met with Donald Trump here earlier in the week. Pretty awkward meeting. I mean, he's being asked to essentially do the impossible in housing thousands more Palestinians, which he's clearly not prepared to do, but he needs the United States to exist, doesn't he?
We have supported them lock, stock, and barrel for many generations, and I don't see us stopping this anytime soon. I hope that Trump was satisfied with the King of Jordan saying, I'll take 2,000 sick and injured children. Yes. Maybe he can do humanitarian things to assuage President Trump. But I think the pressure goes back onto Egypt now. They canceled their trip over here. I think you'll hear Trump will comment on that at some point in particular. And don't forget about the UAE and Saudi. It seems like the vice president's, Rubio's going to go over there soon. Mike Waltz might go over there soon. So there's a lot of activity in the works.
Well, the long game was normalized relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. We talk about this a lot.
Right.
That this ceasefire might help to unlock negotiations again. You start bombing Iran, we're walking away from that, right?
It could be, because sometimes Iran says, well, you know what, I'm going to hit your regional allies, America, if this happens here. I don't know that they would do it. We would be over there in some sort of presence to try and shoot down the missiles that were headed towards our allies. But it would be an iffy proposition, and I don't think they're ready for it.
Benjamin Netanyahu does not want to see a phase 2, is the conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
Will he find a way to reignite this fight in Gaza? He's promising intense fighting if hostages are not released tomorrow.
I think that he's under real pressure from President Trump. It's so early in the Trump term. I know Ron Dermer and people that are close to him are saying you just can't defy the president right now when he's saying he wants all the hostages done and he wants that distraction over with. Yeah. That's the real new factor that Netanyahu has to deal with. It's no longer just Biden anymore pushing for things. It's Trump. He's going to be here for a long time, and Trump loves to use leverage, and he doesn't want that relationship to go in the ditch.
How long is the window for Iran by the time they build up their defenses once again to make that impossible?
It's hard to say. It's probably a matter of 6 months or more. They need new stuff back from Russia, which obviously has a lot of other designs on their own equipment. But it's not going to be there forever. I mean, Hezbollah and Iran are already trying to rebuild, so they need to think about doing it sooner rather than later, and they need to figure out how many sites they can hit.
Someday we're going to have a lighthearted conversation. I just know it. Michael Allen, Beacon Global Strategies, thank you for bringing your experience and expertise to the table, as always, here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. Glad you're with us. We'll assemble our panel next. Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino on the way in here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
You ever been fired by email? How about voicemail? This does happen from time to time in our little business, maybe yours. And if you work for the federal government, it's part of your new reality as the purge begins. Thousands of workers laid off and messages delivered through pre-recorded videos. That's cute. And on group calls. Some ordered to leave the building within 30 minutes. Not even enough time to pack up the desk. Washington Post says the purge begins now as the Trump administration moves swiftly to fire thousands, directing to begin with agency heads to terminate trial and probationary staff. If you just got in the building, don't get comfortable. That'll affect as many as 200,000 employees. Reaction from the American Federation of Government Employees, the biggest union representing federal workers. Employees were given no notice, no due process, no opportunity to defend themselves in a blatant violation of the principles of fairness and merit that are supposed to govern federal employment. But this is just the beginning, right? Not that many took out the buyout offer, and so they are now being fired. Not just here in Washington, but all over the country where most of the federal workforce lives and works. This is, of course, all going back to the DOGE and the efforts of Elon Musk and his team digging through various agencies, trying to find the cuts. And if you ask Elon Musk, and to the extent that he spoke to the World Governments Summit in Dubai, you just lop off the whole agency with nothing left. Here's what he said.
We have to really delete entire agencies, many of them. That's not to say there won't be an increase over time of bureaucracy in some new administration, but it'll be from a much lower baseline. So it's a step in the right direction. I think the overarching goal here is to lay the foundation for prosperity that will last many decades, maybe centuries.
See what the panel thinks. We're joined now by Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital, Republican strategist, Jeanne Zaino, Democratic analyst, political science professor at Iona University. They are both our Bloomberg Politics contributors. What do you think about this idea, Jeanne, of deleting entire agencies? Elon Musk went on to say, quote, "It's kind of like a weed. If we don't remove the roots of the weed, then it's easy for the weed to grow back." Is he right?
That is quite an analogy to describe people in our government. The reality is we fought a revolutionary war to fight back against a tyrant in the form of the King of Great Britain. And we have clung to that importantly throughout our almost 250-year history, that no one person should accumulate power in that way. And now here we have an unelected person who is responsible to no one, is not transparent in what he is doing, up there talking about making these kinds of cuts. That is deeply concerning. And of course, that's why we're seeing all these lawsuits come out against this kind of exercise of power. And already public opinion polls show how unpopular this is. Elon Musk's approval rating is underwater. Yes, we can trim, cut, we can be more efficient, but that's not what they are doing and not what they are interested in, and not a process that they are following that is legal or that is something that we've ever seen in the United States. And so all of those things are deeply concerning.
Rick, you've worked with your share of bureaucrats in your time here in Washington, in the Senate and in the White House. Elon Musk says, "I think we do need to delete entire agencies as opposed to leave a lot of them behind." Will he accomplish it?
Yeah, I think he will be able to do that. Look, there's nothing in the Constitution that specifies which agencies of government should be existing, and many of these are relatively modern affectations of expansion of the government role. Department of Education is a classic example. Since Ronald Reagan, it's been orthodoxy in the Republican Party to say that we're going to get rid of the Department of Education. Linda McMahon is just in the process of getting confirmed. Maybe, she can just stay at home and not have to worry about coming in the office. But, this is a state function, not a federal function. There's a lot of argument to be made that those closest to the education, and we have a quilt of different rules and regulations that govern education as well. It should be. The last thing we want is federal intervention in the teaching of our children. And so, nobody's making that argument, but that's been the argument for 50 years in the Republican Party. Commerce Department, Howard Lutnick, let's put him out of a job. We have duplicate trade roles, and you scratch your head and you wonder, well, what do we really need a Commerce Department for if we believe in market economies and the free trade system? So at the end of the day, I think, we have to understand there is only 2 elected officials in the executive branch. Never has been more than that, president and vice president. They tell their staff, and a cabinet secretary is a staff member, what to do every day. And that's all that Elon Musk is doing. He's just a little bit better at it than most have been in the past. And so I'm not condoning all his tactics, but at the end of the day, much like in his first term, Donald Trump said, hey, every Republican president says they want to make Jerusalem the location for our embassy, and he's the only one who's done it. So, and look at that's worked out just fine. So at the end of the day, I think we got to give him a little bit of space here. And Jeannie's right. There is a recourse. Go to the courts and let them decide. What is legal within our system.
How about that, Jeannie? Your thoughts on the way Rick just framed that, having just heard Elon Musk say that we're talking about laying the foundation for prosperity that may last many decades, maybe centuries. So is the temporary pain worth it?
I don't think anybody said that the bureaucracy is in the Constitution. But when we reference the Constitution, it is the fact that we live in a democratic state and that the president, not directly elected, but indirectly elected, and you do have members of the cabinet, they are responsible and responsive to the Senate. Elon Musk is not in that track. Sure, presidents appoint all kinds of people, including family members, but they do not wield this kind of power, nor are they on the dole for the federal government. Let's not forget Elon Musk and his companies get huge amounts of money from the federal government, and we're not seeing any cuts there. So there is absolutely a case to be made that what is being done here is improper. And we will see the courts have upheld certain things, like the retirements, the buyouts, at least at this point. But most of the other things that this unelected official person has talked about, they have not upheld, at least so far. And they have said we have to take time to look at it. And let's not forget, this is all being done against a backdrop of a Republican Congress that is talking about $4.5 trillion dollars in cuts so that they can extend tax cuts for the wealthy. So this is the environment in which this is being had. And so this is the impropriety that people are feeling, and this is the frustration that they are feeling, and people are starting to voice concern about that. Yes, you can cut the federal bureaucracy, but don't forget, when they tried to do it, what did George Bush end up coming in to do in 2000? To take back education to the federal level, because it was that unpopular with the American public. And we are still the sovereign people in the United States, not people who are appointed by the president and beholden to no one, especially not the wealthiest person in the world. So there is so much wrong with how that was just laid out.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the budget resolution that was passed out of committee last night. This followed 12 hours of debate, the defeat of dozens of Democratic amendments. As I said, we had a lot of noise in Washington yesterday, a lot of talk about Donald Trump, no fewer than 4 encounters in the last 48 hours with the media, a lot of threatening of tariffs. Nothing was actually implemented. We did set the timeline on some to be. The real news yesterday, Rick, was this. A budget resolution approved by the House Budget Committee, as Jeanne mentioned, $4.5 trillion in tax cuts, at least $1.5 trillion in spending cuts. Is this something the Freedom Caucus can endorse that could actually be passed on the floor?
Well, I think, we heard from the chairman of the Freedom Caucus that he got a deal cut. His deal was that the Freedom Caucus would be for this bill as long as, they would be able to explore another $500 billion in cuts to get it to $2 trillion, by the time the tax cuts are approved. So they got bought in, and I see no opposition to this bill at this stage. Conceptually, they could win by one vote on the floor of the House of Representatives and have one big, beautiful bill. That'll put actually a little pressure on the Senate now to finalize their budget resolution that does not include the tax cuts. What I'm hoping is that we get a step back, and has been discussed on this program today, not just look at tax cuts, but tax reform, because there's a lot in the tax code that can save Americans a lot of money, that generates revenue without stifling our growth, and be a better tax code. Gone are the days of the debates about flat tax and things like that. But the idea that we are going to spend this amount of political capital in re-upping these tax cuts and not actually revise the tax code just seems to be a missed opportunity to me.
Jeanne, the Democrat on that panel, ranking Democrat Brendan Boyle of Pennsylvania, called the proposal cruel, heartless, and toxic, harmful to low-income families by slashing Medicaid. We've only got about 30 seconds. Is he right?
Well, it's not only Brendan Boyle. He's absolutely right. It's also Steve Bannon, who warned everybody last night that a lot of MAGA supporters in red states really, really like Medicaid and are on it. And these cuts are draconian. The president has said privately he agrees. This is the challenge they have with $800 billion cuts to Medicaid.
Great conversation with our signature panel. Jeanne, thank you, and Rick as well. Jeanne Zaino and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. On the fastest show in politics, we're going to turn our attention back to Ukraine. Talks underway today in Munich. Melinda Haring from the Atlantic Council is up next on Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
President Trump is set to sign more executive actions. There has been some reporting that it will be directed at the Department of Education, but we have not seen the president yet. He's going to be soon making tracks for Mar-a-Lago, where he'll be spending the weekend here. J.D. Vance, the vice president, carrying the message of the administration today at the Munich Security Conference, where Ukraine is story and issue number one. In fact, it's not just J.D. Vance. He was meeting a short time ago. They could still be underway with Volodymyr Zelenskiy, the president of Ukraine, there as well. Following a speech by J.D. Vance that really raised a lot of eyebrows, directed toward Europe, but also in an interview with Politico, suggesting that troops are very much on the table, suggesting as well that sanctions against Russia may also be employed if no deal can be reached. The gears are starting to turn. We did hear from Volodymyr Zelenskiy in Munich earlier today. Here he is.
I will meet with Russians, with only one Russian guy, with Putin, only after we will have common plan with Trump, Europe, and we will sit with Putin and stop the war. Only in this case, I'm ready to meet, not in other compromises platforms.
That's where we start our conversation with a true expert. We wanted to reach out to Melinda Haring because she's been with us every step of the way since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And as we seek peace, we want to talk with the senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. She's senior advisor at Razom for Ukraine. Melinda, great to have you back here on Bloomberg TV and radio. How seriously are you taking the opening salvo in these negotiations? It was an interview with the Wall Street Journal, in fact, where J.D. Vance said everything is on the table. How is the Trump administration posturing itself ahead of talks?
Hey, Joe, thanks for having me back. So it's been a big week for the war in Ukraine. And we saw the actual opening salvo was Donald Trump's tweet this week. And he said a lot of things, but it opened the question of territory. It opened the question of NATO. It opened the question of long-term security guarantees, and also the question of American boots on the ground. And we've seen the administration pull back, and where they are today and the way that it looks could obviously change tomorrow. But the administration is currently saying that the 1991 borders, so a much larger Ukraine than what we see right now, is possible. NATO membership is possible. They ruled out American boots on the ground, so that was one no-go. But in the original statement, it doesn't mean that American troops couldn't be in Poland or in nearby NATO territory. But really, the issue is about long-term security guarantees. And J.D. Vance said today that we're going to put a plan together that gives Ukraine real security guarantees, and we're all waiting for what those details are, Joe.
This follows what we heard from the defense secretary yesterday, Melinda, and I'm sure you were listening when Pete Hegseth ruled out U.S. troops for Ukraine, suggested that a return to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders was an unrealistic objective, and suggested that the country would never be able to join NATO. Which do you believe?
So I believe today's version. So you have to remember that the defense secretary has waffled. His positions have been all over the place. He is not the decider, as George W. Bush would like to say. So I'm going to go with today's version. And if I have to go with yesterday's version, Joe, I want to parse it a little bit. The headlines were not as bad as they were made out to be. So even if Pete Hegseth's version wins, the U.S. is not recognizing the 20% of Ukraine that Russia currently occupies as Russian. So that's one. Washington is not saying NATO membership is never going to happen. They're saying it won't happen now. And there's a possibility of putting U.S. troops in NATO territory to back up European troops. So even if the worst case scenario, what Hegseth said is true, that if that turns out to be policy, it's not terrible. It's not great, but it's not terrible, and we can work with it.
Okay. Well, that's good perspective. When it comes to pre-2014 borders, though, Melinda, how realistic is it in any conversation to have Crimea return to Ukraine?
So, Joe, Crimea is the tricky question. You'll remember that the Russians illegally annexed Crimea. This is the boot of
Yeah.
Ukraine, the peninsula, in 2014 in a sham referendum. And the status of Crimea is still disputed. The Russians occupy it and they have a military operation there, but Ukraine says it's ours. And the best historical example that the international community looks to are the Baltic states. So even when the Soviets occupied the Baltic states, they refused to recognize them as Soviet. And the international community has done the same thing for Crimea. So in these negotiations, I don't expect to see Crimea formally change hands. I don't think that Ukraine is going to be able to get it back legally right now, but the international community and Ukraine will continue to recognize that it was illegally taken, and they have the hope and aspiration that Crimea will be returned to Ukraine someday.
You know, we talked a little earlier with Michael Allen this hour, Melinda, and he was very skeptical of Vladimir Putin's objectives here. Some see a Russian president seeking an off-ramp. Michael Allen said he's only looking for a short-term ceasefire so he can regroup in Ukraine. What do you think?
I think that's right. I think Michael Allen has put his finger on it. I don't see a lot of momentum on Putin's part or desire on his part to seek a ceasefire. He thinks he's winning. He's still taking territory. It's slow going, but has momentum, particularly in the Donbass, and there's no reason for him to jump ship. He wants to destroy Ukraine, Joe. That's his goal, and he's doing it slowly but surely. And he's betting that he cares more about Ukraine than the United States or Europe does. And that's still, that was the decision and the calculus he made in 22, and that's his calculus now.
Well, surely Donald Trump knows this, right? How can you negotiate with an actor who does not have a motivation to seek peace?
So that's a really good question. It's unclear what Donald Trump thinks about Putin. And his motivations, I think, are opaque, to be generous. So I think Donald Trump wants to be a peacemaker, which is a great impulse. You know, the New Testament says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be children of God." We all want to be peacemakers. But the conflict in Russia and Ukraine, the war in Russia and Ukraine, is very difficult. And I think Donald Trump is learning the hard way that the devil is in the details, and it's going to be difficult for him to broker a real, lasting, and just peace in Ukraine. So I think we're going to have to wait and see.
The headlines from Ukraine today are not terribly encouraging as Zelensky continues his trip to Munich. Ukraine says a Russian drone hit Chernobyl, the nuclear plant, actually targeted Chernobyl on purpose, Melinda, causing significant damage to the containment shelter that surrounds the reactor. Russia says Ukraine staged the attack, which is straight out of the playbook that we've seen over the past couple of years. Are we about to see a fit of additional violence in Ukraine ahead of any kind of a deal?
Joe, we don't know exactly what we're going to see, but the drone attack on Chernobyl is part of a larger pattern. Every day, I just got back from Ukraine. I was in Dnipro, in Kharkiv, and Kiev for 10 days. And every day is uncertain. You don't know if you're going to wake up the next day. You don't know if you'll hear drones in the morning. You don't know if your apartment building will be hit with a ballistic missile. You don't know if your train will be struck. This is the uncertainty that people live with every day. But I expect Putin to continue what he's doing. He's trying to destroy Ukraine as a sovereign, independent country. Joe, I went out to one of the old villages, one of the small villages in Kharkiv Oblast near Izum. And this is a city that you'll remember that the Russians occupied. Went out to a village, and in the gymnasium, there were books tied up. And I said, "What are these books?" And they were books that the Russians had taken in this Ukrainian school. They tied them up in rope, and they were planning to burn the books because they want to destroy Ukraine's educational system. The books were in Russian and Ukrainian. That's Russia's vision for Ukraine. They want to destroy the educational system, and they don't want the country to exist.
Wow. These are the firsthand stories that Melinda brings us that you won't hear anywhere else. I want to bring you back to that speech from J.D. Vance, Melinda, the vice president, speaking earlier today in Munich with a focus directly on our European allies. Here's what he said.
The threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
Not a lot of applause in the room there. Not a shocker, Melinda. I'm not sure what you thought he was referring to there, but is he strengthening America's hand? Is he strengthening Ukraine's hand by turning criticism on Europe right now?
So, Joe, I want to take the most generous assessment of J.D. Vance's speech. And I think the most generous assessment I can give you is that he is trying to provoke the Europeans into action. And he's right to do it. The Europeans have been lazy and they have talked a big game. And here I'm pointing my finger at Germany and France in particular. You know, there's a lot of good countries like Poland and the Lithuanians and also the Nordic countries that have done a huge amount for Ukraine. But Germany and France in particular, they like to talk and they don't do. So I think he's right to point out that Ukraine is in Europe's backyard, and it's time to actually to make good on all the promises and secure Europe.
What promises are we talking beyond paying dues to NATO and beyond investing in each country's own military? Is that what we're talking about, or is there more than that?
No, there's more than that. So if you go to the Kiel Institute's website, it's a great think tank in Germany. It looks at the commitments that country donor governments have made and then the actual amount of military kit that they've delivered. And in many of these cases, there's a huge gap between the promise and the delivery. So I'm saying Germany and France in particular need to make good on the promises that they've made and deliver.
We've rarely heard your commentary hit Europe so hard, Melinda. What's the big picture here? If talks are starting now, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin apparently are going to get together. At one point floated to get together in Saudi Arabia. Apparently that's not going to happen. What's the window for negotiations? When does this war end?
So this war ends when Vladimir Putin decides that it ends. That's the hard truth. If Donald Trump pulls out and sends no more military assistance, Ukraine will keep fighting, and the Ukrainians have 6 to 8 months more where they can continue at about the same pace. So even if the United States says no more, it's over, that doesn't mean it's over. And you heard Volodymyr Zelensky saying, any negotiations have to involve Ukraine. So don't try this Yalta-like format where you exclude Ukraine. We're not going to agree to it. So I think we are getting closer and closer. We see Trump wants peace. He wants the rumor is, Joe, that he wants the Nobel Prize, and he thinks that bringing peace to Ukraine might give him that. And let's hope, if he can do it, absolutely. But it's really a question of when Putin has decided that the costs exceed the benefits, and they don't at this point for Moscow.
Does a peace plan need to be permanent to win the Nobel Prize?
You'd have to ask the committee that one. I would urge them, though, to only issue a peace plan that involves a just and lasting peace. And that's going to mean some kind of security arrangement with permanent presence of troops in Ukraine. And it means Article 5 guarantees. And unfortunately, NATO membership is not on the cards right now, as Pete Hegseth mentioned yesterday.
Melinda, I'm really glad you could join us today. Melinda Haring, Senior Fellow for the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center, Senior Advisor, Razom for Ukraine, and just back from Kyiv, as Melinda mentioned. Thank you for the insights, as always, Melinda. Fascinating conversation as we try to track the ball here on negotiations surrounding Europe. We've got another day in Munich tomorrow as talks will continue.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon and 5 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Yeah, you made it to the end of the week, and boy, I haven't even mentioned Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day. It's not just the Friday edition, it's the Cupid edition. And the White House knows this too. If you check out the Twitter page at the White House, producer James pointed me to this. Roses are red, violets are blue, it says. Come here illegally and we'll deport you. Donald Trump, the last of the romantics. It's a big day at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So we have to talk about some hard decisions. An important thing happened last night, by the way. We talk about all the noise that comes out of the West Wing every day, and there are going to be more executive orders, we're told, being signed around 1 p.m. Eastern time. Sometimes you forget what to pay attention to, and I got into that a little bit yesterday. We're going to be the flashlight in the dark for you, where there's actual news, because while Donald Trump was threatening reciprocal tariffs all day long, none of them implemented. Maybe they will be someday, maybe they won't. Something actually happened last night. A budget got out of committee in the House. This is a big deal. If you listen to this broadcast, we had Ralph Norman on yesterday talking about some of the tough decisions that they need to make here when it comes to spending cuts to make the Freedom Caucus happy, tax cuts to make Donald Trump happy. There are a lot of moving parts here. So they get it out of committee, even as the Senate is marking up its own bill. The big questions, though, remain, beginning with how you pay for it. And this is where things get complicated when you add salt, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, no tax on anything, I guess, anymore. And so some decisions are going to have to be made. I dared you to stay with us for this conversation. You hear about the sausage being made. We're going to do this right now. We're going to figure this out a little bit together and try on some ideas, because a group called Arnold Ventures just produced a report on wasteful spending and proposed ways to cut and save. The face of that study is George Callas, who served for 15 years on Capitol Hill, a senior tax counsel in the U.S. House of Representatives, was on Ways and Means. Former Speaker Paul Ryan also served as counsel for the House Budget Committee. So we have the perfect voice for this right now. The report offers 20 reforms, 10 spending cuts, 10 tax loopholes to close. You will not agree with them all. But according to this research, if they all ended up in the legislation, Trump tax cuts are paid for. What a concept. George Callas is with us right now in the studio. It's great to see you. Thanks for coming in. I hope I framed that close to being what we have here. You've got cuts, you've got loopholes. I want to walk through some of these specifically here. But as you sit in front of me right now, having been through this process before, do you actually believe that all of these proposals that Donald Trump rolled out during the campaign, on top of the 2017 tax cuts, will end up in a final piece of legislation?
Well, first of all, Joe, it's great to be here. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah.
It is hard for me to prognosticate. You watch Congress just like I do, and it's hard to know what's going to happen in 24 hours, much less as we get to the end game. I think yesterday's markup at the House Budget Committee was the first step in a long and winding road, to quote a Beatles song. And there'll be a lot of twists and turns before this thing, gets to an end game. I don't know about the president's proposals. My sense is some of them are maybe higher priorities than others. They certainly add a lot to the $4.5 trillion cost of simply making permanent the expiring tax provisions from 2017, and digs our hole even deeper. We put out this report, and it wasn't just me. It was, at Arnold Ventures we have experts. I'm a tax expert. We have healthcare experts, higher education experts, and this was a collaborative effort to come up with what we thought of as a balanced proposal. 10 spending cuts, 10 tax loophole closers that we think are politically viable, and therefore we really want to put them on the table and have Congress take a close look at them. Our view is that Congress can do both and should do both, and what I mean by that is both make permanent and extend pro-growth tax policies that simplify tax filing for American families, make the tax code fairer, but also do it without increasing our already unsustainable debt burden.
Well, that would be a feat based on what we've been hearing. So just to be clear, before I start getting specific, you're looking at TCJA without all of the other additives, without tips, without overtime, without moving salt. Is that fair to say? We're looking at this in the 2017 structure.
That's how this project started.
Fine.
I mean, that was the basis.
Just
for
to
it.
set the baseline
Right.
here. So number one, let's start with spending cuts. You find up to $1 trillion by modifying risk adjustment payments to Medicare Advantage insurers. This is heady stuff. It's complicated. But as you write, insurers receive higher payments for enrollees with higher risk scores. You make the argument that creates strong financial incentives for insurers to make their patients appear sicker than they actually are. So what do you do with it?
Right, and so this is the policy that can save up to $1 trillion.
That's a lot of money.
You can, as we say in kind of DC parlance, you can dial it, right? You can do less than the whole. It's not everything or nothing kind of policy. But it's a good representation of the kinds of policies that we proposed, in that we think not only can Congress save trillions of dollars, but they can save trillions of dollars before they have to go straight to things like cutting benefits or raising people's tax rates.
And this would not cut benefits.
That's right.
Okay.
This is about wringing inefficiencies and waste out of the system.
Yep, got it. Simplifying student loan repayment. You find over $200 billion there by simply streamlining 7 plans into 2. How easy would that be?
That's right. Well, I think from a technical perspective, it's pretty easy. In fact, legislation to that effect has already been introduced. So there was clearly congressional Republican support on the Hill for it. You know, politically, of course, as we know, 1 or 2 votes in the House on a partisan bill can stop anything.
Sure.
So, but there is clearly interest in doing this. We think the policy case is strong. You know, a lot of this money is going to law students and medical students who earn a lot of money. A lot of it goes to professional students who just get degree after degree after degree that may not be worth a whole lot and then get their loans forgiven. Okay. So there's a lot of poorly targeted money there that could be targeted better at the students who are really using it appropriately.
You call for repealing the IRA expansion of the EV tax credit, electric vehicles. That is a savings of You find another $100 billion there alone. Elon Musk going to let you do that?
We'll have to see. I don't think from what I've seen, he hasn't been shown much concern about reducing the EV subsidies. I think there's a view that of the IRA green energy package that the Democrats enacted in 2022, the EV subsidies have like the least bang for the buck. They cost the most relative to the climate impact they have. And so if there's any low-hanging fruit in the green energy space, I think it's the electric vehicle area.
All right, so we're flying along, pretty smooth flight so far. We're about to hit massive turbulence. Ready? Apply the SALT cap to businesses. Brace yourself. $823 billion. I thought we were going to raise the cap on SALT for individuals. I'm assuming you don't want to see that happen and you want to add it to business. Is that right?
Well, right. So there's currently a $10,000 cap on the SALT deduction.
Yep.
If you simply extend everything, it stays there. I think from a policy perspective, the ideal SALT cap is $0.
Someone's screaming right now in New York. I can hear him.
Well, I like to say I would double that amount for married couples.
Okay.
Double the 0.
Mike Lawler's calling. He wants to talk.
I suspect, yes. I suspect I'll have a note from his office when I get back later this afternoon. But, the policy rationale is that if somebody's in the 37% federal tax bracket and their state raises their taxes by $100, if there's an unlimited SALT deduction, it only costs them $67 or $63.
So they just keep hiking property.
And the other $37 is basically paid for by the rest of the country. And so, that rationale applies to both individual taxes and to business taxes. Now, I would say the revenue from extending it to business taxes is pretty substantial. And there are a lot of good pro-growth business and corporate tax relief provisions on the table as well, provisions that I think we would say are good policy. And so maybe the corporate SALT deduction revenues should be allocated mostly to those provisions, whether Trump wants to reduce the corporate rate further, depreciation, R&D, things like that.
My terminal is exploding right now on this. All right, if I had time to mention one more, this loophole, this is right down the middle for the Bloomberg audience. Reduce tax preference for stock buybacks over dividends. A lot of people watching and listening right now are going to bristle at this idea. Why would it work?
So that's a good example of another principle we have with a lot of these proposals, which is we're not trying to punish people. We're trying to find areas where there's non-neutrality, where there's economic distortions, and move closer to economic neutrality, because in the long run that leads to more economic efficiency, more economic growth, a stronger economy. There is a tax distortion that from a tax perspective using stock buybacks to return cash to shareholders is favored from a tax perspective compared to just paying out dividends.
That's why they just keep buying stocks.
That's why they keep buying. Right. And like, we're not against stock buybacks, but there shouldn't be a tax subsidy for stock buybacks, right? Okay. Penn Wharton budget model did an estimate. There's currently a 1% tax on stock buybacks.
Yep.
Penn Wharton budget model did an estimate that said the economically neutral tax would be about 4.6%. That would eliminate the tax advantage and make them equal with dividends. So we've proposed, not going over 4.6, if anything, undershooting to reduce that distortion. Let the market decide.
Have you sent this research to the Doge?
We have distributed it widely to policymakers in both the executive and legislative.
What kind of
branches.
reaction are you getting?
I haven't heard from Elon yet.
Okay.
But we've gotten a lot of interest. We've gotten a lot of interest from Capitol Hill.
I'm sure each office finds a different component that they like here.
That they like and that they don't like.
Yeah.
Right.
So then they all go in the room, they bang their heads against the wall and try to come up with something. When you add politics to this document, how realistic is any of this?
That's a great question. So again, if you're assuming that this is a partisan exercise and that every Democrat's going to vote no,
you know better. Yeah.
We know that everything is difficult in the House because they have a 1 or 2 vote margin. Senate has a little more of a cushion. So everything is politically difficult. It's sort of a baseline matter. Now, we did apply kind of a political viability test to identify our top 20. And we think there's enough interest in these proposals to make them viable.
Achieving fiscally responsible tax reform. I've got the hard copy here. You can find it online. It's pretty remarkable. Arnold Ventures, you won't agree with it all, but at least somebody's taken a crack at this. Great conversation, and many thanks for being with us. George Callas, pleasure to have you with us here on Bloomberg. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.